Welcome, everyone. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure
to be here.
Yes.
Feels like coming home, in fact.
That's wonderful. So tonight, Brian and I will be discussing how the recreational cannabis industry is taking shape. For context, we'll start by providing you with an overview of the industry space. We'll then hear about the human capital behind the development of this fast emerging industry. We'll then transition into the topic of consumption, and in particular, we're going to be focusing on the consumers, what it is that they'll be consuming, and we'll also be addressing issues related to the uncertainties around mass commercialization. After consumption, we'll be transitioning into the subject of value creation and value capture by cannabis companies. For a fuller picture of how this industry is shaping up, we'll be addressing supply chain issues and subnational variation and local governments' responsiveness to the cannabis business. And finally, before opening it up for Q&A to the audience, we're going to be closing by looking beyond Canada at the global realities of this industry. All right. So before we get started with the questions, let's go for an overview. I think. Okay. All right. So starting with this figure over here, according to a UNODC report that was published in 2018, Canada has the fourth highest consumption rate worldwide of cannabis. It's at around 15% after Israel, the US, and Chile. Uruguay, the first country to allow for a nationwide cannabis recreational market, is ranked 13th at a consumption rate of about 9%, while the US is at 17%. And then comparing Canada's consumption rate to some of the countries that Canadian companies are expanding into, we've got Chile at close to 15%. We've got Jamaica and Poland at around 7%. Jamaica and Denmark at about 7%. And we've got Colombia at about 3%. And we can think of Poland and Mexico, which are not shown here, which are at about 2%. The Health Canada Task Force, published in 2016, indicates that the majority of marijuana in the Canadian illicit market is believed to be domestically produced. In 68 countries worldwide, cannabis seems to be an active sort of public policy issue. On medical use, about 2/3 of these countries legalized cannabis for medical use without restrictions, while 8 legalized it with some THC content restrictions. In the US, 33 states have legalized it. Noteworthy is the momentum around legalization for medical cannabis seems to have primarily come from the Americas and Europe, but that's expanding. Vis-a-vis recreational use, in 1/5 of these countries, recreational use is illegal, but sanctions are unenforced. In 1/2 of these countries, personal consumption is decriminalized. In the US, 10 states have legalized recreational cannabis, and 13 have decriminalized it for personal consumption. And of course, Canada and Uruguay are the first and the only 2 countries for the time being to have legalized recreational cannabis nationwide for both personal consumption and for commercial activity. Cannabis is consumed for a variety of reasons, recreational, medical, cultural, and then for each use case, we can think of a variety of ways that it's consumed in. And the methods of consumption vary, right? From smoking to edibles to beverages to topical applications. And the reality is that these are effectively the kinds of products that are currently in the process or have already been commodified by cannabis companies. About 2/3 of publicly listed companies worldwide are Canadian. They lead in size, as defined by market capitalization. Size and dominance of Canadian companies is part and due to the accessibility to Canadian banks. Middle-tier banks and recently larger banks like RBC and the Bank of Montreal service the cannabis industry in one form or another. To give you a sense of dynamics over time, about 50% of companies that are included in the Global Cannabis Index were founded between 2007 and 2018. Closer to home, the most recent Health Canada statistics indicate that 154 producer licenses have been issued to date. Probably there's quite a bit more that's currently in the queue. 46 were issued in 2017. Around 71 were issued between 2018 and 2019. And so between 2017 and 2019 alone, we're at 76% of producer licenses were issued. And these licenses are primarily issued in Ontario, in Quebec, and in British Columbia, which tend to be the most populous provinces in Canada. It's also the case that, as you know, Ontario and Quebec are the manufacturing centers. And a number of producers have multiple licenses, which means that they have multiple production sites. So this is big business, and it's exploding with major implications here in Canada and globally. So turning to you, Brian, we'd like to start by getting a sense of your profile and what it is that attracted TGOD to you, and whether it's a typical profile as we're thinking about sort of the people who are in leadership positions that are stewarding the growth of these companies.
Yeah, probably not very typical. In fact, I mean, if you asked me a few years ago or someone told me I'd be working in cannabis, I would not have believed them. My background is consumer products. I spent 25 years with P&G working in 8 different countries around the world. We moved back to Canada 4.5 years ago because we wanted our children to go to high school and university in Canada, and P&G didn't have anything for me, so I moved to the wine industry. And actually, there's a lot of similarities between wine and cannabis. You got a large agricultural footprint, product development process that's part art, part science, heavily government controlled, regulated, taxed, government controlled distribution. And so basically in late 2017, Constellation Brands, a large US-based wine and beer manufacturer, made an investment in Canopy Growth, which is the biggest cannabis company. Brought a lot of legitimacy to the industry, but a lot of new eyes started focusing on the industry, and I started getting lots of calls at Andrew Peller from other licensed producers wanting to do a similar deal with Peller. At that point, I knew nothing about cannabis, wasn't a consumer, didn't know the industry, so started doing my due diligence, understanding it. And it was eye-opening for me, just understanding the whole medical side of the industry, how it's helping people with so many indications, and even on the recreational side versus other kinds of products people are using, whether it's opioids or beverage alcohol. So started doing my diligence, understanding, okay, developing a strategy for Peller, how do we defend against cannabis, being a beverage alcohol company, and how do we participate? Because the opportunity was so big. And then TGOD gave me a call last January, am I interested in coming over? And so I did my diligence on TGOD at that point, and I really loved the unique story about TGOD in terms of the organic business model, the sustainability footprint, all our buildings are LEED certified. The whole mission statement of the company is making life better, which I loved and really resonated. So yeah, I was definitely interested. So I started in March. It's been a year since I've been in it. You were asking kind of the typical profile. I'd say with the legal licensed producers, most of the people coming in the early days came out of the black market. They knew how to grow the cannabis product very well, right? And then over time, as people started seeing, when Trudeau came in, started talking about legalizing the recreational market, then you had a lot of people coming in from investment banking, capital markets, who recognized the business opportunity, right? And they knew how to attract capital, they knew how to create projects, and so a lot of people came in from that. And I think more recently now, you're seeing more people like myself coming in with CPG background, with pharma background, with retail, a lot more professionalism coming in, who know how to then take to the next step and actually operate companies.
Okay. Perhaps you could also tell us a bit about the kind of people that you work with.
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at our team, I said I started in March. I think most of the original founders, actually the original founders were a Dutch couple living in Hamilton. They started growing cannabis in their basement for their daughter, who has a rare form of epilepsy. When the first rules around access to medical marijuana came in, they got a license, and they brought some investor friends together and built a 7,000 square foot facility on their farm. When Trudeau came in and talked about recreational, Rob Anderson, the previous CEO, he and his team came in. More capital markets guys. They knew how to raise money, how to kick off the expansion to have kind of our 1 million square foot facility that we're building. But they realized they never ran a business. So last March, or last January, they went out and brought in a new team across every function, sales, marketing, finance, and specifically looking where the future of this industry was going. It's not about cultivation, building these big facilities, growing. It's about developing medical and consumer wellness brands. So specifically went out there and tried to bring in a CPG team. So if you look at our senior team, we've got a lot of people from different CPG industries, from pharma, retail. We have over 200 years of CPG experience on our senior team. That's probably the only company in the industry that's got that depth of bench strength proven experience. Because for me, that's what's going to make the difference. Like in that chart you see there, 150 plus companies have licenses. There's another 800 in the queue. In 3 to 5 years from now, there's not going to be hundreds of cannabis companies. There's going to be 5, 6, 7 big companies, 20, 30 craft growers, like you see in beer. There's not going to be hundreds. And who's still going to be around is not necessarily who's got the biggest bank account today. Everyone's got a lot of access to capital, in Canada especially. It's going to be who can execute. And that's why we really focused on having an operating team who's been there and done it in beverage alcohol, in food, in beverages. I mean, where the future of this category is going to be.
Okay.
So.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to transition into consumption. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to start by looking at the section of the cannabis market that's been out of the shadows for longer, and that's the medical cannabis market. And this is effectively the one that paved the way for the recreational as it is today. So starting off, between 2015 and 2018, the number of registered medical marijuana users grew from about 24K to 340K. Over the same period, dried cannabis sales grew, but they started to plateau at around 2017. And yet, dried cannabis production continued growing over the same period, only to be ramped up in early 2018. It appears that that's around the time where licensed producers were getting ready for the fact that recreational cannabis was about to be legalized. And it is the case that medical licensed producers could actually end up pushing the product that they've created under their medical license into the recreational market for sale. Now let's have a quick look at the consumers. According to the National Cannabis Survey conducted in the fourth quarter of 2018, so that would be October through December 2018, we've got 15 to 24-year-olds, 27% actually, of 15 to 24-year-olds consumed cannabis at least once over the past 3 months, compared to about 20% of 25 to 44-year-olds, a tenth of 45 through 64-year-olds, reaching no more than 5% for people who are at the age of 65 and over. For some perspective, 15 to 24-year-olds make up about 12% of the Canadian population, while consuming at significantly higher rates compared to the 3 other age groups, who make up about 27 and 17% of the Canadian population, respectively. The recreational market in cannabis is estimated at $5.7 billion. Compare that to the medical cannabis market, which is estimated at $758 million. So really, the medical cannabis market is about 13% of, if we want to think of it in terms of size, of the recreational cannabis market. So Brian, in light of this quick overview, I'd like us to start off with the question of how cannabis companies are thinking about these different consumer segments and what they have to offer each.
Sure. So this is an interesting slide here. If you look on the left side of that inverted pyramid, you've got the medical market. On the right side is the recreational market. We're actually growing organic, which plays kind of across both. But what's legal today in Canada is basically just the bottom of that pyramid. It's the dried flower that people are smoking or buy pre-rolls, and it's the non-vapor oils that's consumed orally. What you find in the black market today, when you saw that kind of 6 billion number of recreational, includes all of the other products as well. So there you can find vaping products, you can find pet healthcare products, edibles, and beverages. What we're expecting, what the government's committed to, is legalizing the rest of those categories next October, though it's probably a chance it might be delayed a few months. But that's where I do expect, and the industry is expecting, a lot of future growth. So, and when you're looking at those demographics, I saw, much higher percentage at the younger consumers who are consuming because it's being smoked, and older consumers aren't smoking as much. I do expect, especially on the CBD side, where you get away from the THC. So if you think about cannabis, there's over 100 different cannabinoids in it. The two most prevalent in the plant are THC, which is psychoactive. It's the one that gets you high, makes you feel euphoric, and CBD, which doesn't have those properties but has a lot of other medical properties, helps with inflammation, helps with pain, helps with relaxing. So if you think about my mom, for instance, she has a hard time sleeping. Having a sleep shot with CBD that's not going to get her high but help her sleep is something I could see very easily that she would love to have, right? So next year, when beverages become legal, those are the kind of products that I think will appeal to other pieces of the demographics. And that's what we're focused on as well. That's not necessarily what you find if you go to legal US states. So if you go to Colorado or California and you go in a dispensary, what they've been focused on very much is kind of the THC, which is what the black market had been focused on. So the plants have evolved over the last 20 years to increase the THC percentage year after year, because that's where they made the money, right? So if you go into these dispensaries, what you find is many consumers, when they walk in, they become Rain Man right away, and they start calculating what's the THC, the cost per gram of THC. That's not where I see the future, where many in the industry see the future. When I have a glass of wine, it's not to get drunk, right? It's to relax, unwind, enjoy my food, enjoy kind of company, family, friends. That's really where I see the future of this industry going. So when you think about beverages, it's much more kind of lower dose products with less than 10 milligrams, where we see kind of huge growth potential.
But it's also the case that you will be focusing on, say, different strains as well as,
yes,
as cannabis companies, right?
Yeah, so you've got many different strains out there today. There's hundreds of strains. Each one has different combinations of THC or CBD and has different effects. So when people talk about high, there's different types of high, right? So generally people talk about indica versus sativa. Indica is kind of more relaxing, while sativa is more energizing, so depending what kind of a high you're looking for. The way to think about that, like indica in the couch, is more relaxing, versus sativa, which is kind of sit up, if you want to kind of think about it. Those are the two kind of general strains, and then under that you've got a number of different strains. In terms of legally, we cannot make any claims on our products that this product helps you with stress, or this product helps you with sleep or anxiety or things like that. But that said, and you don't have a lot of hard evidence from like real studies because it hasn't been legal. A lot of those studies are starting now to provide hard evidence on what combinations of the different cannabinoids, but also you got other things in the plant, like terpenes, which is what gives it the smell, and there's hundreds of terpenes as well. So it's a combination of those that lead to have different types of effect. As legal companies, we cannot put on our products that this helps with different indications. But that said, these products have been around for decades in the black market. Consumers know what works for them in different ways. And so you're getting a lot of blogs now, websites that are making links that, okay, LA Confidential strain helps with anxiety, for instance.
And that's a knowledge base that you're drawing on.
Right.
Okay.
Right. But that said, now that it's legal, there is a lot more R&D going on. We're investing in R&D. You're seeing a lot of other companies invest in R&D to provide the real evidence that will allow us to make efficacy claims in terms of this product works better than other products for certain things, as well as around form, what form works best, right? Okay. I do see, today if you look at that market, smoking is the biggest market. And even if you go, Colorado's had legalized recreational the longest. It's gone from 90% smoking down to less than 45. California has only been legal for a little over a year, and they're below 30% smoking. So I do see a lot more growth. I mean, vaping is probably about 20%, but coming from other forms. Because smoking, I mean, even if it's a medical product, isn't the healthiest way to consume
Yes.
it, right? Vaping is healthier than smoking, where you're not burning it. And then when you come to edibles and beverages, it's better still.
Right. The point is that, but it is the case that you're going to have strains and content with various THC concentrations for your product, irrespective of sort of what the method of consumption is. So
Yes.
with edibles, you'll probably have different concentrations. Same thing with beverages, right? So
Yes.
in a sense,
Though I
you're
think
gonna
Health Canada is being very conservative in their approach around dosing and how much you can have in a package. And I mean, much more so than what you'd find in the black market today, where you can find, I mean, really high dose products. You won't find that in the legal market next year.
All right, the next question actually that we'd like to turn to is related to the fact that cannabis companies tend to identify 3 industries for disruption. The first one is alcohol, the second one is tobacco, and the third is pharma. And typically when scholars refer to disruption, they actually mean gaining new market footholds, which means disruptors are looking for ways to basically get non-consumers to become consumers of the products that they have on offer. What are cannabis companies' plans for disrupting each one of these markets?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, this is an interesting slide here, because these are the 3 you mentioned who are being disrupted. If you look at the market cap of the 3 biggest pharma companies, you've got a market cap of over 800 billion, right? The top 3 tobacco companies, about 350 billion. The top 3 beverage alcohol companies is over 300 billion as well. If you take the top 7 cannabis companies, it's under 50. And it just kind of shows you, and when you think about disruption for pharma, I mean, there's huge markets when it comes to pain medication, when it comes to epilepsy, anxiety, inflammation. There's studies coming out now on Parkinson's. I mean, there's many, epilepsy, obviously. There's many areas of their historical kind of market that is being disrupted by cannabis, whether it's THC or even CBD products. Tobacco, probably there is some disruption, but less so, I would say.
What does it look like? Can you give us an example?
So for pharma?
For tobacco, for example.
Well, tobacco, I mean, you've seen a lot of growth in vaping, especially with younger consumers. So if they can vape THC or CBD products, versus tobacco where you don't have the nicotine, and it's a health, especially on the CBD side, has a lot of wellness benefits.
Okay. So rather than smoking cigarettes,
Yes.
they'll basically be consuming, say, CBD products.
CBD or THC, I mean,
Okay.
but it doesn't have the addictive properties of nicotine, generally, or less addictive, I would say, for sure. On the pharma side, I mean, that's what you have. I mean, you can get today even capsules, right, with cannabis oil in it, which is helping for pain, helping for sleep, helping for many indications. Yeah. It may not say that on the bottle, but people know what works for them. Beverage alcohol is very obvious as well. I mean, if you think about it, we've actually licensed this technology out of Colorado from Stillwater. It's called Ripple, and it's basically a sachet you rip and open, and you can pour it into any beverage, right? And so if you think about THC, if you pour this in, it's water soluble. It's got an onset within 10 to 15 minutes. And so if I can have a drink that doesn't have any calories, doesn't have any risk of hangover, is easier on my body, on my liver, and from a consumption standpoint, that's a significant disruptor to beverage alcohol. And that's why Constellation invested $5 billion in Canopy Growth this past year. That's why Molson's now investing in it. They see that, and we see in legal markets in the US, beverage alcohol having been impacted in terms of cannibalizing that category. But that's just on the THC side. I think the market on the CBD side could be even bigger, right? So if you have drinks then, or edibles with CBD in it, that has a faster way of getting bioavailability into your body, helping you with sleep versus other medications that have other side effects, there's benefits there. Or think about functional beverages, right? Pre-post-workout drinks, things like sleep shots or vitamin waters are huge categories that will be disrupted. So I mean, there's other categories. That's why, I mean, you've seen news articles of Coca-Cola looking at the space with Pepsi, many others. I mean, these are going to become mainstream products. I know there's still a lot of stigmatisms and biases that is associated with cannabis in the general population. But over time, as we move away from smoking to products people are familiar with, things that look like chocolates, look like other edibles, look like beverages, I think a lot of those biases will go away. It's similar to the end of Prohibition, right? There was a lot of stigmatism against alcohol in those days that today is very different.
All right. So in late 2017, the American, no, actually before doing that, we're going to actually move into the question on continue working with product development. So how do consumer trials and product development in the cannabis industry work? We often think of consumer trials as being about whether people want to buy a product, and when we're thinking about clinical trials, we're concerned about safety and efficacy. So how are these objectives integrated or possibly separated in the R&D activities of cannabis companies?
So I would say the R&D is following that full spectrum. You've got clinical trials now starting, now that it's legal, in terms of the full kind of clinical approach, which tends to be very expensive, takes a long time. But that said, you still have a lot of anecdotal evidence coming out of the black market that they know it helps with people. I would say on the recreational side, it's more like consumer trials that's happening, which is focused on, and on the agricultural piece, there's a lot of R&D on developing kind of plant health, but focused on efficacy. So how do you get faster bioavailability? When it comes to beverages, for instance, I mean, you can't put cannabis oil into a liquid and it doesn't mix, right? Because oil doesn't mix with water. So you need to encapsulate it with micro or nano encapsulation kind of technology, or find a way to make it truly water soluble, to be able to get it to disperse evenly. So there's that piece of R&D in terms of happening. But then from a consumer side, figuring out, okay, how do we get faster bioavailability? So, because people who have been used to smoking or vaping, it's instant gratification. Within a couple minutes, you start to feel it. When it comes to buying edibles, I mean, it can take 1 to 3 hours to start to feel it. And especially in the black market, you don't have consistency in product. So you could have a cookie and all the THC is in one corner. You're sharing it with a friend. One person gets high, and the other person doesn't, right? Or so they have another, and then they have a really bad experience. That's the problem. You don't have the consistency, and that's where legalization can help, because you'll have the investment in the technology to make sure you've got better quality product, better consistency.
So to be clear, so for instance, when you refer to microdosing or when you refer to sort of sustained release, we're talking about consumer products or consumer trials. We're not talking about clinical trials. And just for clarity as well, when we talk about developing products that will be used for recreational use, they are under a completely different regulatory regime, it seems, than cannabis-based products that are being developed for medical use.
Not
is that
really,
accurate? Or no?
Okay. So, I mean, the research going on is going on both, but the products today in Canada, in medical and recreational, are identical. It's the same.
Yes.
So the difference about medical versus recreational is more how do you get your product, right? So for medical, you go to a doctor, you get a prescription, and then you go directly to the licensed producer and you order it from the producer. And it comes through the mail, you go to their website, you order it. So we sell directly to patients on the medical side. On the recreational side, it's the exact same products, but it's going through government wholesale in every province, where the government is controlling the distribution and the retail.
So it's
but it's the same product.
It's the exact same regime as well in terms of regulation and testing and sort of the standards that you need to meet in terms of standards of evidence. Before
So in terms of the standards around growing, around quality, all of those are the same in recreational and medical. Canada is making sure that we've got really tight regulation to make sure you got proper and high quality product, and it's the same across both. So even, I mean, there's a number, probably about a dozen approved pesticides, for instance, right, in Canada that licensed producers can use. We're organic, so we don't use any of them, but they want to make sure that whatever is being used is safe for consumption, for human consumption.
All right. We're now going to transition into the final part of the consumption theme. And so in late 2017, the American National Academy of Sciences, Medicine and Engineering released a comprehensive report assessing the extant scientific evidence surrounding cannabis. It concludes that we still have much to understand about cannabis's pharmacological properties and also how changing the manner and the frequency of its consumption can impact users' health. Last week alone, the Lancet Psychiatry published the results of a large-scale case-control epidemiological study that was conducted across 10 European sites and 1 Brazilian site. The study establishes a causal relationship between cannabis and first episodes of psychosis. The study finds that daily cannabis use increases the odds of psychosis by a factor of about 3 compared to never users, and by a factor of about 5 for daily use of high-potency cannabis. And high potency is defined in this case as having a THC content of at least 10%. So the question is the following. The speed and the effort with which cannabis companies are creating specialized and well-integrated everyday cannabis product lines seems somewhat premature and risky. How are cannabis companies navigating this uncertainty space and the risks of mass commercialization?
Okay, so there's a few different things within that question. First of all, I mean, this is different than a pharmaceutical product where a drug company has created a new molecule and then needs to have all of the detailed studies to prove safety. I mean, like we heard earlier, this product's been in use for millennia, right? It's not something new, it's widely used. The market's already $6 to $7 billion in Canada and hundreds of billions of dollars globally. So it's not a new product. There is a lot of data from usage in coming out of the black-gray market. I mean, if you look versus other types of products, whether it's opioids where thousands of people are dying every day, or alcohol poisoning kills hundreds every year, I mean, there's not a single case that's been proven of anybody dying from marijuana use overdose. I mean, what an overdose in marijuana is, most likely 90% of people kind of fall asleep. There is some who do have kind of more issues around paranoia and things like that, or vomiting, which is a smaller amount. But I think going back to the other part of the question, it's daily use and especially high quantity. In my mind, that's a risk across anything. Like anything that's not used in moderation is not good for you. So I mean, the biggest health issue today for Canadians, or probably in many countries around the world, is not even opioids or alcohol or cannabis. It's probably sugar, right? I mean, that's what's causing more health issues than anything else these days. And again, so it's a matter of moderation. So I don't know the details of that specific study to be able to comment on that specifically, but I can say, anyone who is using a high amount of cannabis on a daily basis, that's not good, as it's not good to do anything in a high amount.
So the point, in a sense, sort of the point here is to basically get a sense of how mass commercialization. It's true that cannabis has been around and has been consumed for millennia, but the reality is that mass commercialization in the way that we're seeing it now is actually new. The sort of experimentation that is being conducted in-house in terms of methods of consumption is also somewhat new.
Actually, I don't think so. So, I mean, if you look, I mean, in the data we saw earlier, if it's already in Canada, the rec market is $6 billion. That is mass commercialization. But there isn't the controls, the regulatory environment to make sure it's being done properly, it's being grown without harmful substances, it's not mixed with any harmful substances, that the supply chain is protected, protecting the quality. So by legalizing it, you're getting that, which is actually bringing higher product safety than what's happening today. Because today it is mass commercialization. It's not new. What we're doing is we're bringing it out from the underground to a legalized environment that's heavily regulated, heavily controlled. So for me, that's adding safety and peace of mind for consumers, that they know it's followed the rules that Health Canada's put in place, and is a healthier, legitimate product.
So I think when we think about sort of the science and the uncertainty of the science, I don't think it's about sort of mixing, whether you're mixing cannabis necessarily with other products, or purity. I think the issue is that there's uncertainty about the compound itself, about cannabis itself. And so setting aside even the issue of possible mixing, and yes, there's probably a lot more quality control on product now that it's actually on the legal market, and it's being sort of cultivated in-house by companies, under a regulatory framework. But the issue here is that actually cannabis itself is something that, in terms of its effects, we're still somewhat uncertain about. And we are transforming, this product is being transformed, right? Companies are experimenting with different modes of delivering it. Companies are experimenting with different breeds, with combinations. That's part of sort of the product differentiation, right? As we think of cannabis companies who are trying to make it in this industry.
Yeah, I don't think that's new, though.
Okay.
Like my point on the black market or gray market, whatever you want to call it, it's been the same. I mean, all those producers have been experimenting, constantly increasing the level of THC. All of the product forms that the legal companies are talking about, or what's going to be legalized in Canada next October, they exist today. So they're already in the black market. You go into a dispensary, I'm sure here, even in Montreal, and you'll find beverages, you'll find edibles, you'll find bath bombs, skin creams, everything. It exists. People have been experimenting for a long time. So that's not new. I think what you're getting, though, with the legalization and the work that the licensed producers are doing is you're getting more science behind it to understand the why it's having this impact, to understanding the whole, what they call the entourage effect, which is when you bring together different percentages of THC versus CBD and different terpenes, how it all works together. Okay. That science hasn't existed before. People kind of know anecdotally, okay, this strain helps me with this, or that strain helps me with that, but no one's had the science before. Now that it's legal, there's a lot of investment going in to figure that out.
Which is great, but so this brings us back to the question of just getting a sense of how cannabis companies are dealing with this issue of uncertainty and possible risks. So what kind of thinking is there around that? What kind of awareness is there around that? And that's why you're seeing a lot
of work going on. And I'd say the medical side is leading it, and then it's flowing down to recreational. A lot of studies going on to prove how the different things interact with each other, how different delivery formats work, whether you're talking about kind of skin patches versus oral sprays versus oils versus different delivery methods, vaping, how they all work. Again, none of those things are new, but you haven't had the investment in the science behind it. So I think the companies, what companies are doing is they're investing to develop the science behind it, and ideally kind of the IP behind it, because I mean people want to patent unique ways of delivery, right?
Yes.
Because in the end we all have shareholders that we need to deliver for.
All right. Okay. So next we're going to transition into the topic of value. Institutional and retail investors are very excited about this fast-growing industry space. They're betting heavily on pot stocks. So starting with market cap and how market cap has changed over time. The market cap of publicly listed cannabis companies has grown by close to a factor of 6 from early 2015 until March 2019. And this dwarfs the high-growth industries in US and Canada, which have grown by about a factor of 1.2 over the same period. And if we want to get a sense of how people are feeling about pot stocks, we can look at how much they're willing to pay for a dollar of sales. While significantly less exaggerated than early 2015, by March 2019, cannabis stocks continue to be trading at a premium compared to high-growth Canadian and US stocks. But perhaps the most interesting issue for us to address is related to how we should be thinking about the cannabis industry space as it develops. So should we be looking at tobacco, at alcohol, at generic pharma, at commodities? And so, Brian, what sector space or spaces do you see the cannabis industry returns settling into and resembling most closely, and why?
Yeah, and I know there's been a lot of kind of hype around cannabis stocks and people comparing it to the dot-com bubble. For me, this is nothing like dot-com, right? So, I mean, in those days, we were measuring eyeballs and computer screens. There really wasn't revenue. In cannabis stocks today, yeah, there's a little bit of revenue, but it's tiny relative to valuation. But that's because, I mean, very little amount of the market is actually legal. I mean, out of that $7 billion market size that you saw, most of that is still underground because the LPs don't have, the licensed producers don't have enough capacity to supply the legal market. But what you're seeing is everyone is building tremendous capacity. I mean, we're building 2 facilities. We'll have a couple 100,000 kilos coming online in the next couple of years. Everybody else is also building. So as that comes online, then we do expect more of the market to transition out of the black market and to become legal. And that's where you'll start to see the real valuations. Because when you're looking at like multiple of sales, they're not, what investors are doing is they're not looking at today's sales. They're where do they expect revenue to be in 2020, for instance, not 19. It's actually funny when you look at the valuation methodologies, how this industry's evolved. If you go back about 2 years ago, what the analysts were looking at is, okay, how big is the company's vault size? So how much cannabis can they store? And we're going to value based on that. I mean, just completely crazy metric. And then evolved to capacity and then funded capacity. Now they're starting to look at, okay, what's the revenue potential for 2020? Over time, it's going to become an EBITDA multiple like you'll find across all other industries. It's a matter of time for the industry to kind of catch up and be able to supply the market and have normal kind of comparables. Because right now, I mean, very few companies are making money. Everyone's investing for the future. And not just in Canada, because I mean, here you've got Canadian companies who really have leadership. I mean, Canada's got a lead on the rest of the world because of legalization has provided Canadian companies access to capital that nobody else has, right? We're able to list on the Toronto Stock Exchange, on the Canadian Stock Exchange, on the Venture Exchange. So we got access to capital that we can get capital and we can expand globally. The US companies, I mean, you've got some of the greatest entrepreneurs down there and technologies, but they're landlocked. They can't leave their state, let alone the country, because they don't have federal legalization. So that's the benefit Canadian companies have. So when you see these market caps and valuations, you can't really look at current sales. What you can look at is, okay, where do you expect the future to be? And so if that $8 billion converts from black market to legal, it's not going to happen overnight. It'll take years. You can put a value on what's that worth. You know what the operating costs are going to be, the cost to grow. But then if you look beyond Canada, Canada's 37 million people. I mean, Europe is 20 times that. Latin America is about 18 times that. Global cannabis market, the expectation is it's got potential to be anywhere from $250 billion to $500 billion. 500 billion. That's a huge market where Canadian companies have a first mover advantage. And so when you look at those market kind of valuations, the upside's tremendous. The real issue is there's that 150 licenses out there. Not all companies are going to be successful. So it's going to come down to who is able to execute and who's still going to be around in 3 to 5 years. And most of those companies will not.
But so as far as thinking of it as an industry space, is it going to,
I'd compare probably closest to beverage alcohol.
Okay.
Because that's where I see the most similarities. Versus pharma is very different. What you're tending to value there is more kind of the R&D, how many patents, how many clinical trials do they have in the pipeline. Tobacco is a bit unique, and I'm probably not as familiar with that.
Okay.
But I would say ongoing, the closest similarity will be to beverage alcohol.
All right.
And to some extent CPG, but more beverage alcohol.
Okay, great. Okay, so now we'd like you to tell us a bit about how a pre-revenue company like TGOD, which didn't have products on the market until early 2019, was able to go public and grow its market cap in the way that it has. And you're already, it seems, making plans for the New York Stock Exchange.
Yeah, so we actually did our IPO last May of 2018. It was the biggest IPO to date. It has been the biggest to date in Canada, 132 million in our IPO. Our current market cap about 1.3, 1.5 billion, depending on the day. And you can see there it's kind of the fifth biggest from a market cap in the Canadian companies. How did we get there, I would say, is having a very clear business plan. To grow organic cannabis at scale. So there's only 3 certified organic producers in cannabis. Today you've got Whistler in BC, When their second facility is complete, they'll have 5,000 kilos of production. You've got Organigram on the East Coast. Again, only about 5% of their production is organic, but similar. We've got scaled organic production that will produce at the end over 200,000 kilos of organic. Okay. So that's a big differentiator that the market understands and is putting a value on. Though if you can look relative valuation, we've actually got the 4th biggest funded capacity, but our market cap trails our peers, and part of that is because we have been pre-revenue. Okay. So we're trading at a discount because we haven't proven that at scale. Though, I mean, last quarter we published, actually just last week, our 4th quarter of 2018. And we had our first revenue actually in Europe, not in Canada.
Yes.
And then just this week, we've launched with medical patients in Canada. A small kind of pilot, a couple hundred patients to more test the pipes, the order, shipping, billing kind of process. But we'll be expanding our patient count this year as our facilities in Hamilton come online. And then in our big facility here in Valleyfield, just outside of Montreal, will be 1.3 million square feet when it's finished, which is huge. It'll be the largest facility of its type, especially on organic, but also in terms of LEED certified, leadership in energy and efficiency. 90% of the water is collected, recycled, really focused on having a sustainable footprint, because that's what organic is about and our consumers are looking for. So in terms of how did we get to be that successful in terms of market cap, I'd tell you we're just getting started. We're lagging really where our peers are, and I believe 2019 will be a pivotal year for TGOD to prove that yes, our facilities will come up online, we can grow it at scale, and clearly the market is there. Okay. I mean, Hill and Knowlton did a study in Canada and found that over 60% of medical patients would prefer organic, and about 50% of recreational consumers would prefer organic. And that's huge. Now, when they go to the shelf, that same percentage won't buy when they see, okay, it's trading at, it sells 30% more expensive. But even if it's only 25, 30% of consumers, that's a huge market, and that's what we're laser focused on. Okay. So I don't want to be everything to everyone. We'll let kind of the other companies there battle it out for their 75, 80% of the market. I want to own the organic space. Okay.
So this brings us to the issue of proprietary IP and patents, which seem to be a key feature of cannabis companies' strategy to capture value. Scholars tend to argue that patent regimes are broken, and usually they turn to pharma when it comes to making a case in point. And they argue that a key problem pertains to the fact that when we think about the domain of what is patentable, it has increased since the 1980s. Patents are no longer restricted to actual inventions, as in tangible sort of products, but now they include discoveries, so the knowledge behind the products. And one can imagine that when we think about a nascent industry where the knowledge base has yet to be developed, such as cannabis, this might very well be susceptible. It could be an industry that's susceptible to this concern, particularly since, as you've been mentioning, early mover advantage preferred by uneven legalization is eventually going to peter out. So what are cannabis companies doing to create an open knowledge ecosystem that allows a learning rate by the public, by scientists, and by regulatory bodies that is at the very least in line with the pace with which products are being released to market?
Yeah, there's some key differences versus pharma, where a company's creating a new molecule which is different and patentable. In cannabis, I think some of the things will be harder to patent because there's so many companies working on similar things that I think it'll be difficult for them to actually patent it. That said, there for sure is a lot of work going on creating intellectual property, and part of it will be patent.
Can you provide examples? Like
yeah, so I can tell you for us, I mean, we're actually looking on many elements to have more, I would call trade secret versus a patent. Like so in organic growing. So David Perron, I mean, a genius in growing, he actually came from the McGill agricultural department here, went to Whistler and got them certified. We poached him from there, and he's been working on a lot of R&D around soil, for growing organic soil and the nutrient flow. So his soil has 30 different components. Half of them come together in one facility in BC, half of them come together in another facility in Quebec, and they finally come together in our facility. It's not something you want to go and patent, because if you patent it, people can figure out, okay, those ingredients, this one's providing nitrogen, I can use this other ingredient instead. It's something you want to keep as a trade secret, because in the end, we want to make sure that we have better products than our competitors, and so we want to have better yields, all the rest of that. So, I mean, there's some things that will be shared, and especially when it comes down to indications. It's like we can't put on our products that this product helps you with sleep or this product helps you with anxiety. But that's where you get a lot of consumer forums. And you've got websites and blogs that consumers are putting in, hey, this is the experience I had. And you've got apps that are doing that as well, comparing different companies, different products to get that easy access to knowledge for other consumers.
Right, but what about sort of access to knowledge that is being produced by cannabis companies, to the extent that there's quite a bit of investment in R&D and there's quite a bit of investment in developing and learning more about this product? Because presumably to even push product to market, you're going to have developed a base, a knowledge base. And as we mentioned earlier, there's still quite a bit to navigate in terms of establishing regularities around that knowledge base. And so is there anything that cannabis companies are doing? Are they creating a sharing ecosystem so that at least when people are consuming, they are in a way not at an informational disadvantage?
Yeah,
in a
less
sense,
so.
right?
I mean, if companies are spending billions of dollars, right, into research, into facilities, into cultivation, into sales, or into distribution infrastructure, when you're spending that kind of money, you need to get a return on that. So I would say their cannabis companies are focused more on developing IP for their own needs, or creating license approaches. So I'll give you an example of that. There's a technology which has come out of the food industry for dehydrating, for drying products. So if you think like Moon Cheese, there's a company called N-Wave, which produces this vacuum dryer. So when you're drying products in a vacuum, the boiling point of water is much lower than outside of vacuum. So they worked actually with Tilray and got the license rights for this technology for Canada. And so when we're looking at all the different technologies for drying, we actually liked what we saw there, because you can maintain higher quality, better tasting product, because you're drying it in a much lower temperature and much faster, because you can dry products in 45 minutes to an hour, where we'd normally spend 10 days. So we don't need to have all the big drying rooms, or not as many of it. You'll still have some for kind of higher end craft products, but we can do mass scale drying, especially what's going into oil, much faster. So that's a technology that we're licensing, and we're actually paying Tilray a royalty for it, right? So there is sharing there, but people are investing, so they want to have some sort of income stream from other companies, such as royalties or licensing fees.
Okay, which means with respect to what you're learning about cannabis, that's something that's going to remain within sort of the confines of companies, and it's not a kind of knowledge that's going to be sort of shared and built on and exchanged? Generally,
yes.
Okay, all right.
I mean, in the end, we're spending hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. We need to get a return on that.
Okay, all right. Next, we're going to focus on supply chain issues, regulation, and politics. The supply chain of the illicit drug market can be represented by the following pieces. We can think of the change of hands and movement of product impacts. We can think of the change of hands and the movement of product as impacting drug pricing at each stage. We can also refashion this to think about the legal recreational market. So while import and export are probably not as relevant at this moment in time, we can replace that with distributors and wholesalers. Farm gate and processing refers to what the government talks about as the production process, and usually this is what is typically vertically integrated. What's interesting to note here is that when we think about regulation, the federal government is regulating the production process, and there's quite a bit of discretion that is given to provinces vis-a-vis regulation around distributors and wholesalers, as well as retail. And so when we think about regulation in this case, we're saying part of that is, for example, deciding on the extent to which private enterprise is going to play a role. And when we think about municipalities' discretion, it's about the decisions that they go with vis-a-vis either limiting or not exposure of their local communities to, say, retail outlets that sell cannabis. So, all right. So, capital-intensive companies that are vertically integrated are the ones driving the momentum in the cannabis industry at the moment, right? So about 55% of producer licenses allow for cultivation and processing by the same entity. And as we move down the supply chain, it also seems that in some provinces, licensed producers are also and will be allowed to operate their own retail outlets to sell their cannabis products for recreational use. We're even seeing cannabis towns spring up. The momentum momentum with which cannabis companies are swallowing up industry space to cement an early mover advantage is astounding, right, at local and international levels, and we're going to be moving into the international expansion in a moment. But for instance, as we think of TGOD, the annual cannabis production capacity is set to deliver 219 tons, and that's actually equivalent to about a third of the estimated annual consumption of cannabis in Canada. So the question here is, and you touched on it a bit earlier, but perhaps we can develop it a bit more. In 5 years' time, is the industry going to be 5 to 7 players running the show? And what does this mean for small-scale producers or micro-cultivators? And what kind of sort of model are we going to see? Is it more of a tech model where they'll be buying up sort of small-scale producers, or is it more of a distributed production model? So if you can elaborate on
so
that.
I think you'd have 6, 7 kind of big scaled producers who've got million square foot facilities that's growing at scale, that has low cost production. Then you'll have some kind of high end craft growers. For me, I think about beer, right? You've got a few big beer companies, but then you've got lots of kind of craft brewers or microbrewers. It'll be similar to that. Many of the current companies.
That would assume if it's craft beer, then that would assume that they would also be able to sell, right? Because
yes,
when we think of
but they'll sell in their local geography. They won't be a national brand.
Okay, which means that that's going to vary. Your ability to become, say, a craft grower is going to depend on what province you're in, for example.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes. And in terms of distribution and wholesale, that's fully controlled by the provincial governments in every province. So the government is a wholesaler record for recreational cannabis in Canada. What they've done is they've followed the alcohol model. And I come from the wine industry and very familiar with it. So Quebec, if you look at it, the province owns the wholesale and retail, right? The SIQ stores for alcohol and the cannabis stores here are all owned by the government. Alberta is the complete opposite. It's all private. The government is still the wholesaler of record. So they're actually not touching the product, but they're getting their 30-40% markup and banking that, paying for a lot of bills that way, but the retailers are all private. BC is a hybrid. They've got some private, some government retail. Ontario is actually interesting because in alcohol, all the LCBO stores are owned by the government. They've now started giving wine and beer in some of the grocery stores, which is private, but it's still flowing through the LCBO, so the government gets their tax in the end. But with the new government coming in, they changed the rules for cannabis and said cannabis retail will be private, which I think longer term is a good move because, I don't believe government should be running businesses. It's not efficient, right?
Why?
It's not efficient. It's not a market-based environment where you can have then competition to drive efficiency, to drive innovation. If you've got a monopoly, you don't have the incentive to drive innovation, to drive efficiency.
But arguably is the case that if we're, in 5 years, we're going to see 5 to 7 big companies that are effectively monopolizing the market.
Production. I'm talking about retail.
You don't think that's going to happen in retail to the extent that now they're also picking up on licenses as well? And
you will have some big retailers, but I think you'll still have lots of independent retailers as well. Or small kind of regional chains. It'll be a combination of both in my belief.
And so then that brings up to the issue of
over time, frankly, it comes down to the different types of products as well. So for instance, there's a lot of talk at the UN and WHO of deregulating CBD, right? The non-psychoactive cannabinoid. If that happens, and in some states, even in California, you can buy CBD products in vitamin stores, in health food stores, grocery stores, 7-Elevens. It won't just be there, right? So if that's the case, then you'll be buying products in your superstore, in your Walmart, Loblaws, Costco, those kind of products. While the THC will follow more of the beverage alcohol model and be restricted.
All right, and so this actually segues us into the issue of holdup on inventory, which we've been hearing about. So perhaps you can talk to us a bit about that. The fact that there's, wholesalers and retailers seem to be holding a lot more inventory.
It's a bit of a chicken and egg, right? Because you haven't had the legal product in the market, the level of sales hasn't been that high in the legal market. So when you're comparing, what inventory do the legal LPs have, and you compare it looks like, okay, it's 4 to 1, I think was that statistic.
Yeah.
I don't think that's realistic. Once you see more stores in there, there's still a shortage of product.
Okay.
And you hear, I mean, and there's probably a political reason for making that kind of a statement, but if you go and talk to the provinces, you talk to retailers, they're not getting the stock. I mean, we hear from all the provinces every day, they're calling us, I mean, can you deliver products sooner? And from our perspective, I mean, our facilities aren't fully online, and no, I mean, I don't want to, we could have, in fact, I mean, we only started now in medical, and we won't be selling recreational until later in the year. For me, we're trying to build here a wellness brand, a consumer medical brand, and I don't want to be launching a product unless I know I can provide 99% service levels. The worst thing you can do is you get a patient and you can't give them the medicine the following month, right?
But so we're talking about the recretional market, right?
No, even on the medical too.
Yes, but actually we're more,
I mean, you've
seen
cannabis companies out there short shipping their medical patients so they could launch in recreational last October.
Okay.
I mean, that's not how you build a brand in my mind.
All right.
If their patient can't come back and get their medicine, then you'll lose them forever.
So we're seeing tension being substituted away, basically.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to transition into looking beyond Canada. And we're going to be building on your perspective in light of the international experience that TGOD has. And I think the one thing actually that is not lost on anyone is the fact that people are seeing sort of the cannabis industry, and Canadian companies are seeing the cannabis industry not only as a business opportunity, but also as a national Canadian project. To quote one of the cannabis companies, typically the headline does not read "Innovation initiated in Canada to lead the world," but when it comes to cannabis, it is. So, in light of your experience, it would be great if you could give us a sense of how the global cannabis industry is looking on the ground and sort of the kinds of operations and partnerships that cannabis companies seem to be cultivating.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, definitely Canadian companies, because of the legalization and the access to capital, so they've got the money to go and expand internationally, do have the lead globally. That's one of the things that attracted me to this industry, I would say, is a bit of patriotic pride. I mean, most of my career I worked for an American company, but here's a chance for Canadian companies, not just to develop this industry in Canada and bring it out of the black market, but to lead globally. That's super exciting. That's what brought me here, and now we are, I mean, I talked about our positioning as organic. We want to be the organic brand globally. So we are working now, and we've established a joint venture in Mexico to distribute in medical market, but there's actually, the Mexican government is now talking about legalizing recreational. In Jamaica, I think we're probably already today the market leader there, fully kind of doing everything from cultivation to extraction and retail stores there. In Europe, we purchased a business in Poland, which is industrial hemp-based CBD. So it's not cannabis. Hemp is a cousin product, I would say, to cannabis. It's a similar looking product, but has very, very low THC. It's more focused on CBD. So for us, that's our way to enter markets in Europe, because in many markets, it's not regulated in the same way as medical cannabis. You can sell it in different types of stores. So we want to really expand that business across Europe. And then as markets legalize medical, we can launch our TGOD THC brand on top.
So it's taking basically the form of acquisitions and distribution networks.
A combination of both. So the other one is in Denmark, for instance. We've created a joint venture with a company there that's been in the agricultural flower business for 80 years. And we're focused on cannabis cultivation with them. They're really experts at cultivation and at genetics. And they've actually got a lot of kind of patents and IP. They've got this roll patent on their Calincho plant that they grow, which allows them to grow it in a much smaller kind of footprint, but the same amount of flowering. If you can convert that kind of technology to cannabis, you could dramatically increase our yields globally in all our facilities. So I mean, things like that. I think what you'll see over time is more and more the cultivation moving closer to kind of warmer climates where you don't need to spend the same amount of capital as you do in Canada or Denmark in heating and cooling and all the rest of that. And you have cheaper or lower cost labor as well. I mean, the two biggest costs of growing today is people and power, right? So where you don't need to have the same power consumption on heating and cooling. So I mean, a lot of companies, we're in Jamaica, we're building an export field there. at and we'll be able to export TGOD branded product at a fraction of what we could do it in Canada.
Okay.
A lot of companies are expanding in Colombia.
Okay.
It's another kind of hot country for cultivation. I think what you'll see in Europe, I mean, Germany's now created a tender process for cultivation, but really small scale relative to the market size. They're kind of dipping their toes in and learning. And across Europe, I mean, you don't have consistent regulation.
That's right.
So even on industrial hemp, our Cannabis Gold brand, every country has different rules in terms of what's the THC percentage.
So that brings us actually to the next question, which is the extent to which Canadian companies are actively guiding or possibly actively courting governments, foreign governments, to potentially bring their recreational cannabis markets out of the shadows.
I would say we're focused, I mean, all of the companies are focused on working with different governments, helping them learn. In fact, many of them are actually coming to Canada and meeting Health Canada, visiting Canadian facilities, understanding how the Canadian legalization is working and learning from that. And that's why, given all eyes are in Canada, Health Canada is being very cautious, making sure they're not promoting the industry, but making sure they're doing it in a responsible way. So everyone's watching Canada. Companies, yeah, we are going and we're talking with foreign governments. I mean, I've met with people in several European jurisdictions and helping them understand how to do it responsibly, how to do it orderly.
Could you give
but
us
I would say
examples
it's more focused on medical. Right, so I mean, outside of Uruguay and Canada, there is no recreational; it's all medical.
And there's no sort of kind of discussion that's happening, or?
So I think what you need to do, I mean, there's still a lot of stigmas and biases against the industry, right? So that's where it needs to start in medical.
So it is going to do that.
And then people need to get more comfortable with the industry, and then recreational will follow.
So you
now in Canada, it took, 12, 13 years before recreational followed medical. I think you'll see that shorten, but it'll still maybe 3-5 years. The exception is, I mean, if you look Mexico now, the new government coming in, I mean, even before you got full legalization of medical, they're talking about legalizing recreational, and they've been learning from Canada and they're watching Canada. So I think you'll see it happening faster and faster. Clearly, I mean, the market size of recreational will be bigger than medical, where you have both. That's clear.